If you're like how I was when I first started heading into the TF2 economy and like the items and such, when you first looked at the items on the community market or on Scrap or wherever you looked, you probably thought festive items were really cool. And then you saw a bunch of other items with Christmas lights around them and got confused, only to see that they were called Festivized, right? Which, getting into the items and economy rabbit hole nowadays is much more of a confusing and strange thing compared to when I did it almost 8 years ago now. So this video is to describe what the difference is between the two, and then looking at the history of the weapons we all love, and how it relates to Valve's recent treatment of their games in general. I hope you guys enjoy. Festive weapons were initially added in 2011 in the Australian Christmas update, and the last time Valve added festive weapons was in Christmas of 2016. So festive weapons are reskins of weapons in TF2 that add a little bit of Christmas spirit to them, and that can range from a full-on redesigns of them to more simple designs that just have the lights wrapped around them, right? And festive weapons in general are a staple of items in this game, and you can't go very long as a new player booting up the game without seeing a festive weapon and thinking to yourself that you want one, right? But festive weapons are simplistic yet great, and they have a very original and OG TF2 feel about them that has not been lost to time at all. And festive weapons have a special place in my heart, and I distinctly remember being like 12 years old and getting a Steam gift card for Christmas and immediately running to the community market to buy a festive crossbow and charge because I thought they were so cool and I wanted one for so long. And because Smithmas is such a big part of TF2, and because we get a Smithmas every year, the love for festive items is still very big in the community, and the community wanted more of them, right? Which led to Valve trying to think of a solution to the community's love and need for festives, which ended up giving us the Festivizer. Alright, the Festivizer was in some ways a solution to the need for more festives, right? Which the Festivizer was an item that Valve added in TF2 in Smithmas of 2015, which when applied to a weapon, gave that weapon the more simplistic Christmas lights wrapped around it design from the festive weapons, right? And to describe this, I would say that, like, for example, items like the festive scattergun that have a very simplistic, just Christmas lights wrapped around it, right? The Festivizer basically put that aesthetic of like the Christmas lights wrapped around a weapon onto a weapon. But these were different than festive items. The Festivizer just gave a weapon the Festivized trait, which basically just added that aesthetic, but they were different from the limited festive items that were initially given out from 2011 on, right? And so on a first glance, a lot of these weapons are almost indistinguishable from their original festive counterparts, because nowadays it's a little easier to tell because it says festive under one item and it says like the limited time, while the festivized items just say festivized in front, right? It's a little bit different nowadays. But back then, the original festivized items, when they came out in 2015, just classified them as festive. So even though there was a difference between the original festives and the items that just got simply festivized by this new item, they both were just entitled as the festive of that item, which meant that it got really confusing for some of the original festives that looked almost identical to the festivized ones, right? However, although they were called the same thing whenever they initially came out, there was still a visual difference between some, because some of the original festives that had a more intricate design than just the lights still looked different than their festivized counterparts, because the festivized counterparts just added the lights. For example, the original festivized black box, festive black box, looked way different than the festivized black box, even when they initially came out in 2015, even though at that point in time they were both called the festive black box, right? So it sounds very confusing, and it was much more confusing back then whenever they first came out. But nowadays, since 2018, or specifically January of 2018, they made the title different. So now the original festive items say festive and say a limited item inside of the description, while a festivized item doesn't have the limited thing in their description, and they say festivized instead of festive. And this, so with that in mind, right, technically from the last part of this video that I talked about, technically the last festive items were added in 2016, but that's actually more of a technicality, because nowadays these items are festivized, since remember, back in the day, festivized items were just classified as festive. So with finally the distinction between there being festive and festivized items, and although the game in 2018 finally drew them apart by one being called festive and the other being called festivized, this opened the door for a totally different era of Christmassy weapons in this game now. So now that Valve had made the distinction from festive versus festivized, there were good and bad things that came from this. The good thing was that now a lot of these original festive weapons finally got the love that they deserved and weren't grouped in with these more basic items that were just given lights. And it meant that people who had the festive weapons before the Festivizer was added now had a piece of TF2 history, which had the limited description added, which showed that they are limited and old compared to the festivized weapons, right? However, the bad that came from this is that from this point on, they never added a more festive weapons, because that title was now given to just the OG ones, which meant that from now on, they would just expand the list of weapons that could get festivized, which meant that more weapons could have the coveted lights added to them, but no more weapons would ever get the treatment of the more intentional and designed, detailed ones that a lot of the original festives had. And so from now on, it was just the basic lights given from the Festivizers. Alright, and now for the question, what is better? And there are a few answers to this question depending on what you actually want from the weapon that you're getting. The first answer to this question is if you want a Christmassy themed item and nothing else, which in that case I would give it to Festives, because there is much more intentional design in the originals and not just exclusively the Christmas lights. And I would say that in general, festive weapons look more Christmassy and also clean, since they were more thoughtfully put together. Alright, now the second answer to to this is if you are someone who just simply wants a weapon that has lights wrapped around it, right? Which in that case, I hands down give it to the Festivized. If we are looking at some of the original festive weapons that just had the lights wrapped around them versus their Festivized counterparts, they look almost identical, but since the OG Festives are limited and they cost way more, right? While a Festivizer costs you less than $1, which means that in my opinion, if you don't care about the history and just want the lights, just buy a Festivizer, as it will save you money compared to the almost identical festive counterpart. And on top of that, there is a longer list of weapons that can be festivized compared to the original pool of festive weapons. Alright, and now the last answer to this question is more complicated to me. And that to me is, are festives or festivized weapons more unique? And it seems like it would go to festive weapons easy, but I think it's more complicated than that, since you can use a Festivizer on almost any variation of a weapon you like. It's not just a competition of whether a normal festive weapon versus a normal festive weapon versus a normal Festivized weapon is more unique. It's also a competition between what looks better between a festive versus a Festivized Australium or any other of like the Festivized skins, right? Since you're not limited on just stock items that you can use the Festivizer on. So in my opinion, the Festivizer is more dynamic since you can put it on any of your favorite skins or variations of your favorite items to give it more spice, right? So in that regard, the Festivizer is more unique. However, if you want to just look at the difference between designs from just festives versus what the Festivizer actually brings, then festives win. Alright, now that the question of festives versus Festivizer is answered, I want to broadly look at the history of festives and Festivizers and show how well it can be related to the history of how Valve has treated their games in general. So, how festives and Festivizers have come to be is a great analogy of how Valve handles their games in the past versus now. When festives were initially added to the game, although some were simple lights wrapped around the weapons, many of them were deliberately crafted designs which added a whole new aesthetic to the weapons they were going over, right? And when the people wanted more, instead of continuing that deliberate and well thought out approach to making them, they just did the bare minimum and added an item which took the most low effort and simplest of the festive designs and just had the exact same design on all of the new ones, right? And with the distinction of how the originals, with the distinction of originals versus Festivized, they made players happy since now they made a difference between the low effort Festivized weapons versus the originals that people loved, while hiding a more sinister intention that just allowed them to quote-unquote add more to the game in the future while being as low effort as possible, since now they would 100% never be more festive designs like the ones people love from the past so much. And the same is true of how they've handled TF2. With such well thought out and amazing content we have gotten in the past for this game, it is sad that we have now gone thousands of days since a major update. Now alls we have are little Christmas updates or Halloween ones, which just pump hats and other content into the game, like maps that Valve didn't even make. Like, pretty much all of the new things added into the updates is stuff created by the community that gets voted in from the workshop, right? Meaning that Valve can just sit back and relax and add things other people make into the game and call it a day. They have fallen so far from grace, from the days of new updates adding more weapons and mechanics into the game, and even items which had such love put into them, making them, it's honestly amazing, into just letting the community add new maps or cosmetics and calling it a day. We haven't even mentioned bots, which is a conversation for another day. But yeah, I just wanted to make this video not only to answer the question for new players of whether Festives or Festivizers are better, and what the difference is, but also because I think the history of Festives and Festivized weapons, although bland, exemplifies the change of Valve's attitude towards one of their most successful games of all time. Alright guys, with that being said, I hope you have a good day, and I'll talk to you later.
This wall is you if you don't subscribe. Oh, piece of shit.